sorts of cooperation and without conflicts and so on and so forth. The Poland was a dominant force in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth when it comes to the Lithuanians, when it comes to Rus and Ruthenians. So Russia becomes that major threat in the 19th and 20th century, even earlier with the partitions of Poland. But there is also Poland there, and there were Mongols before that. Both nations actually came into existence in a tough environment and found themselves in a situation where one could support another and could reinforce another. Not all of that was as idyllic as I described. There were conflicts, there were tensions as well. But if you talk about the arc, that was the arc, not the arc of tensions and conflicts.
Thank you. We'll definitely return to individual segments of that arc. But before we do that, I was curious, Professor, besides the big narrative that's been constructed and, of course, perceived by, as Benedict Anderson would say, imagined communities, right, of nations. But I was also curious about the act of encounter, because that individual encounter is quite important, right? And very often the perception of the other comes also not just from, stereotypes or indoctrination, but also the encounter. I was wondering, Professor, what was your first Lithuanian encounter? Was it some good time by the Baltic Sea, or maybe you've been watching Žalgiris game? No offense to Rytas fans, of course, in the room, but what was your first Lithuanian encounter, Professor?
Oh, I'm sort of a history buff, right? So when people enjoy themselves going to the places into the Baltic Sea, I enjoyed myself reading all sorts of texts. And my thesis during undergraduate years, and then it became the part of my candidate dissertation, was on the Polish Latin language sources on the Khmelnytsky uprising of the mid-17th century. And then I found out that out of three texts that I studied, two were actually Lithuanian. And then there was my frustration when I started to look for the sources of one of them, Albert P. Kailovičius, that was coming from Kaunas in the 1930s, and that was in Lithuanian, the language that I didn't read. So my first encounter started with this surprising discovery, and then this big disappointment and limitation of and understanding of my linguistic limitations. I thought that if I was reading in Latin, then I was okay. It turned out that I would need to have a Lithuanian, and Vilnius was a place where I was really welcomed by Ukrainian scholars. There was really some sort of a family also warmth that came from that. I don't know how many people were coming from southern Ukraine, from Dnipropetrovsk, asking them about the Lithuanian 17th century authors in the rare book division of the Lithuanian National Library, or Library of the Academy of Sciences at that time. But I remember that I wasn't welcome anywhere else where I was going with my requests in Moscow or Leningrad at that time, St. Petersburg. So there was surprise, there was disappointment, there was a lot of warmth. That was my encounter with Lithuania.
Well, let's make one step back, but the encounter question remains there, because you mentioned, of course, the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, and it's interesting that the origins of Lithuanian statehood actually start with modern-day Ukraine. 2019, there is a treaty between 20 dukes and one duchess, and Danila and Vasilko Romanovici of Galicia, Volhynia. And that is actually the first encounter, not between Lithuania and Ukrainian polities as such. On Lithuanian side, that would be Aukštaitija, Lithuanian Highlands. From Ukrainian side, it's Galicia, Volhynia. But also, that's the start of Lithuanian statehood. There is no written source of Lithuanian statehood per se. Ukraine is there at the core of emergence of our idea of statehood. And then for 300 years onwards, we see continuous expansion of that relationship. And it's not only Kyiv, but also Zaporizhia and Podole, and of course Galicia, Volhynia becoming parts of Grand Duchy. So I was wondering, Professor, from a Ukrainian viewpoint, what Ukrainian scholars, and you personally, of course, see as this trigger event for evolvement of the Lithuanian factor in Ukrainian history? What was this causal sort of relationship? Was it a particular battle? Was it a particular marriage? Was it a particular successful military campaign? What was this pivotal event that led us to the Lithuanian factor in Ukrainian history?
I will allow myself to go once again to Putin's pseudo history with Russians and Ukrainians finding the same people. Historically speaking, it will not be good history what I'll just tell you. But historically speaking, there is actually much more historical basis to talk about Ukrainians and Lithuanians as being one and the same people than about Russians and Ukrainians. The reason is quite simple. Lithuania, Belarus, and Ukraine end up on one side of the divide that was created with the Mongol invasion and Mongol control. Today's Russia was under the strict Mongol control and Tatar control, Golden Horde later, for centuries and centuries. That was not the case in what became Grand Duchy of Lithuania. So the legal code of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, there were 3 Lithuanian statutes. It's based on the Rus truth, the legal code of the Rus principalities, something that wasn't there on the Mongol side, on the Russian side of the border, but was very much part of common space, Lithuanian, Ukrainian, and Belarusian, Lithuanian and Lithuanian at that time. If you look at the first Lithuanian chronicles, they're written in the chancellery Lithuanian language, so that they're not written in Lithuanian. So there is, if you look at the princes, especially before Jogaila, how many of them would become Orthodox, right? So that's this historical connections that were there in legal terms, in cultural terms, in linguistic terms, in terms of the creation of a common historical narratives, something that by 19th, 20th century we would think about foundational cornerstones of the creation of nations. So all of that was back there already in the 15th and 16th and 17th centuries. Now, what is the Lithuanian factor for Ukrainian lands? I would say, at least in my mind, it comparable to what was the Varangian or the Viking factor in the history of Kingdom Rus. Because what the Lithuanians did, they actually created their dynasty, and they actually shared that dynasty with the Lithuanians, with the Belarusians, and with the Ukrainians. We don't have in history description of battles in which way the Lithuania just suddenly expanded from a place near the Baltic going all the way to the Black Sea. The idea is that was a deal with the local elites between the dynasty that was able to organize them and unite them in the conditions where the old dynasty, the Rurikai dynasty, was not able to do that. So what Ukraine gets from Lithuania is the sort of unity that comes with a very young dynasty that is not thousands of grandchildren and grandsons and great-grandsons running around and fighting each other. That was important. What Ukraine gives, and Kiev in particular gives, is and lands for some time, its law, its language, its literary tradition. So that was a particular exchange, and what you see then with the passing of time, that the Lithuanian princes really go native in places like Lutsk and Volhynia and so on and so forth. So there is a lot of historical commonality and lack of, at least in historical sources, any information on major conflicts. The founder of Ukrainian National Historiography made sure at Harvard is named after him. Mikhail Hrushevsky was, of course, writing all sorts of wonderful things of what a fantastic state the Grand Duchy of Lithuania was until those awful unions between the Lithuanians and the Poles. That completely destroyed that completely destroyed the paradise that allegedly exists in that part of the world. I think in terms of paradise, it's not good history, but what it certainly betrays is the fact that there is very little historical sources that we can base our assumptions that it was something that was full of conflict and confrontation. We just don't have that.
You know, Professor, I'm a big supporter of the union, so I'll of course I refer back to that, and I acknowledge our Polish guests here also in the second campaign. So, but
well, coming from Yale, I'm not surprised.
I perceive that as a compliment, of course. Now, returning back, of course, to the conversation on the subject matter we all gathered here, I'm pretty confident that the substantial amount of people here in the room, they share the same excitement and pleasure of reading many of your books, but particularly The Gate of Europe. And I made this funny experiment before coming forward to this conversation today. I looked at the index, Professor, of the book. So I looked at the frequency, how often do you mention Kyiv and Rus, and how often do you mention Lithuania in your book, or at least what index tells us about that. And guess what? The frequency is just the same. I mean, more or less it's the same, which is, well, of course, it's a pleasure to witness that, and of course it warms our hearts in Lithuania to see that. But it brings me to another question here, and partially referring to what Mikhail Hrushevsky would write in the mid-19th century. We often debate now about decolonizing, history is decolonizing area studies, and that's important. Notice it's a very important critical insight on the past. What is the post-colonial perspective on Lithuanian-Ukrainian interaction, right? Is the Lithuanian factor perceived, and should it be perceived as a colonial factor in the history of Ukraine?
There is certainly, this is a very legitimate question. This is the question that we should ask our sources. To my mind, the answer to this question is no, because the historical sources don't provide us with that sort of interpretation. And I draw the parallel between the Vikings and the Lithuanians in Ukraine. And we don't think about Vikings and Viking dynasty as being colonial in that sense. So it is a foreign dynasty that comes to that land, that comes to that territory, providing a particular sense of unity and organization, which really is outside of the framework that is proposed and suggested by what is colonism, what is colonialism, which of course is a concept of a later period, very much rooted into the existence of maritime empires and so on and so forth. So it's always a temptation in history to march to the drum of whatever today's the latest demand is, the latest trend is. And by doing that, we are facing the danger of really being ahistorical, imposing certain concepts on the era, on the period where they're not a factor. We still push them there, simplifying things, creating what seems to us being an order where we encounter disorder. Well, there was an order of a different kind, of a different type. So I think that the coloniality is a very important concept, important way of looking at the history of the region, but I don't see it applying really to medieval period, or even to the beginning of the early modern times. Of course, if you try hard enough, you can force any concept on any period and on any region. But I just caution all of us, and first of all myself, against doing something like that.
And that would be valid also for just before 1569, before Union of Lublin, Podole and Zaporizhia, and of course Galicia Volhynia become part of the kingdom, and therefore they lose this immediate intrinsic connection with the Grand Duchy. That would be applicable likewise to that part of to the Polish factor in Ukrainian history, or not. We're talking about a different framework here.
Let's talk about a little bit about Union of Lublin. So this is 1569, right? So what happens there is that this is one at the end of the long list of unions between the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, which includes Lithuania, Belarus, Ukraine, and the Kingdom of Poland. This is pretty much a hostile takeover of part of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. That part was Ukraine. But the trick is that hostile takeover of the part of Grand Duchy of Lithuania, how it was perceived by the Lithuanian elite, is done with the consent and very often on the incentive of the Volhynian and today's Ukrainian princes. So they are not the group that is being conquered. They're the group that is negotiating with the Kingdom of Poland on the guarantees for their language and religious rights. And from the perspective probably of Lithuanian princes, they're traitors and so on and so forth. They're probably really good guys from the perspective of the king and the supporters of the Union of Lublin. But the point is that they're not. This is not a colonial sort of relationship, either when it comes to the Poland and Ukraine or to Lithuania and Ukraine. And the border that is established at that time between the Kingdom of Poland and the Grand Duchy of Lithuania becomes really very much the foundation for today's Ukrainian Belarusian border. And it's there also for a reason, because there is River Pripyat and Pripyat marshes, which meant that its environment is different, ecology is different, trade routes are different. The marshes were there really dividing the Grand Duchy of Lithuania even before the first union took place. So it's a reality, just acceptance of certain realities. They're important today because you look at the Russian attack on Ukraine from the territory from Belarus, where it goes through the Chernobyl exclusion zone, outside between the Dnieper and the start of the marshes. So that's the reality of the war today. Can you imagine the importance of the marshes back in the 16th and 17th century? So I'm bringing here elements of environmental explanation, but the point is again, I just don't see. I would love to blame Lithuanians, Poles, whoever it is, for alleged colonialism. I just don't see it there. I just don't see it there in the 16th century.
Then, of course, something you mentioned while discussing the arc that brings us bond to Lithuania and Ukraine, we talked also about the national movements of 19th century and early 20th century, and there are many things that determine them, not only uprisals of late 18th century, 1830s, 1860s, not only Romanticism, and that's of course literacy rate, many factors, but also of course some sense of antagonism that is there, some sense of exclusion of the other. And very often, of course, it is addressing the Imperial Russia, but Poles are also the ones who are addressed as the other. And that antagonism is somewhat shared both in Lithuania and in Ukraine for different reasons, but it is shared. Now, fast forward 150 years later, today, we have multiple platforms, whether it be Lublin Triangle, whether it be anything else, where we see such an intense relationship between the three countries, and the people of three countries too. I don't know if ever in the last 150 years we would have such a warm relation and reconciliation at the end of the day that we have at the moment. What do you, Professor, see as the trigger for that reconciliation between the three nations now? Is it events of the most recent developments, or somehow historically approach that? Maybe that's the Ježegedroic heritage as well? What is the trigger there?
There was a lot of tension certainly between the Poles, Ukrainians, and Poles and Lithuanians. And when I say tension, I use very diplomatic language. Here there was much worse than that. But there was also another thing that is extremely important. The Poles were there the first in the region to suggest the model of a nation, where the nation can exist whether the state exists or doesn't exist. That's in the words of the Polish anthem. That was the model and the encouragement for everyone around these nations and ethnic groups like Ukrainians and Lithuanians, whose national project was not even half as developed as was Polish. So on the one hand, there is history, difficult history of relationship. On the other hand, there is Mickiewicz and Kostyuszko, and they come from the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, and they provide the model of this new national awakening. To the degree that when Mykola Kostomarov, the father of the first political text of modern Ukraine, is arrested in Kiev in the late 1840s, and they found in his papers the manifesto that is basically based on the very much on Mickiewicz. He says that well, it's not me. I didn't write that. That's basically some Pole wrote that. That's a Polish text, and he fooled the gendarmes who investigated him. So Nicholas the First Emperor was writing, it's all Polish intrigue. So what you see there is, of course, a lot of historical tension, but there is also a lot in where actually Poles are the first to introduce the concept of nationality in the Russian Empire, to which Russians have to react. Take Polish word for nationality, narodowość, and translated it as narodność. So it's a kalka from Polish. And all of that, what I just described, is happening in the situation where there is a Russian Empire, where there is imperial control, and in that new environment, there is a lot of links, a lot of connections are being formed. And you mentioned Tim Snyder, right? And most probably people here know excellent work that he is doing. One of the projects that Tim has been working for a long period of time, I don't know whether it leads eventually, it led to a number of other books, but not to that one that he imagined, as far as I know, was writing a history of the region with the word brotherlands being in the title of that. Looking at the families in which different members of the family decided that they belong to different ethnic and ethno-national traditions, from Lithuanian to Belarusian to Polish to Ukrainian. And in one of the cases there was 3 sons. One became a major figure in the Belarusian national movement, another in Lithuanian, and another in Polish. And all of them in their memoirs claim that that was the identity that they inherited from their father. So that's I look forward to reading that book once it is written.
Just like the example of Narodowicz family, the first president of independent Poland, his brother was the signatory of the Act of Independence of Lithuania in 1918. So indeed, that split was omnipresent. Professor, you were referring to your encounters in Lithuania because you were writing your thesis at the time that later led you into your first publications too. Now, I made some historical digging en route here, and I figured out an interesting fact that apparently habilitation of your dissertation, so actual Dr. Nook one, took place on March 12th, 1990. Which is one day after the proclamation of re-establishment of Lithuanian independence took place. Just 450 miles away from Kiev, where was your habilitation taking place, essentially disintegration of the Soviet Union was not just discussed or conceptualized or somehow evolved, but actually did take place. Now, I'm curious asking you first about what you recall of those days, because I guess habilitation is a big deal, you probably recall that. But most importantly, I hopefully one day I get there, of course. But the other question, no less important, is of course about the political forces that were dominant at the time. Because in Lithuania, naturally, that was Sąjūdis. In Ukraine, that was Narodny Ruch. And those horizontal links, just like the links of inspiration that the national project of Poles would provide for Lithuanians and for Ukrainians, for other national movements. So was there this horizontal link of inspiration for the national movements, for reestablishment of independence when we talk about Ukraine and Lithuania in 1990?
Thank you. You're absolutely right. I don't remember anything but the defense of the dissertation, and then of course you elated. But then there is just tons and tons of paperwork that you have to do after that. So certainly Lithuanian independence was not on my radar at that time, at that point. But I fully appreciated it later when I worked on my book on the fall of the Soviet Union, the last empire, and I'm very grateful to the Lithuanian publishers for translating a number of my books. So I really, Lithuania for me means something. So I'm glad that those books are there. What you see is enormous role of Lithuania and Ukraine in the story of the disintegration of the Soviet Union. Lithuanians are the first there to declare independence. March 1990, more than a year and a half before the fall of the Soviet Union. They are the first, and Gorbachev starts the blockade, and then Gorbachev, who went down in most of the history as someone who refused to use force, of course uses force in the Baltics and in 1991, and so on and so forth. He is stopped very much by President Bush at that time, who sends him a letter spelling out exactly what will happen if he continues on that path. But that's an extremely important beginning, symbolically and otherwise. Then fast forward to the December of 1991. Once Ukraine is the only republic where the referendum is held on the issue of independence. Once 92% of Ukrainians, more than 80% of the population took part in the referendum. 92 of them voted for independence. Once they vote for independence, the Soviet Union is dissolved within 1 week. So that story starts with Lithuania. It concludes with Ukraine. And then you start asking yourself questions whether that has to do something with the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. and the answer, okay, you read too many history books. Maybe it's not that. But what was real, what is real, and doesn't have to be imagined, is the fact that Sąjūdis serves as a model for very, very much. So what you see there is that there is similar pattern of mobilization that leads, mass mobilization, that leads to the creation of Sąjūdis and leads to the creation of Ruch. And the mobilization happens over the issue of Chernobyl. And those of you who saw mini-series on Chernobyl, that was, of course, not Chernobyl nuclear power plant where the shooting was taking, or the film was taking place. That was Ignalina nuclear power plant, so exactly the same. So 20,000 people in Lithuania mobilize over the issue of Chernobyl, but start actually try to stop the continuing production of nuclear energy at Ignalina. Out of that mobilization comes the next step is the creation of societies. You look at Ukraine with some lag in time. By 1988, the first mass manifestation is on the issue of Chernobyl and ecology and so on and so forth. From KGB archives now in Kyiv, we know that that was also the time when the leaders of the Ruch wanted actually to declare creation of the Ruch. It doesn't happen. They switch off the microphone. The film is being created, microphone, but the Ruch happens a few weeks later. So there are direct connections and there are parallels. And I will keep digging on to what degree that is related to the history of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, the story of the Soviet collapse in 1991.
Thank you, Professor. Well, let's give a chance for the audience here in the room, and of course, and we have the first question, of course, from our Polish friend over here. Mr. Kamiński, please, the question is yours.
Okay,
so it wasn't prearranged?
No, it wasn't, and I will try to be gentle, so no worries. Well, first of all, in case of Union of Lublin, well, yeah, I will say it. Well, we need to remember that the nobility from Poland and later basically from Ukraine, basically they asked Poles to help them with the discrimination from the Lithuanian elite. What might be not obvious, but still. Obviously, as a Pole, I think that the greatest achievement of Lithuania and the Lithuanian elites is that they liberated Ukraine, now today's Ukraine, from the Golden Oath and Tatars, which later, also thanks to the Union of Lublin, helped to create this, the conditions for the Ukrainian nation to rise. Obviously, as a Poles, we have a bit more troubled history with Ukraine that we have with Lithuania. Nonetheless, from our perspective, we always had the problem with Russia in the sense that whereas Poland was more willing to fight against Russia before our collapse in the 18th century, we had the problem with the Lithuanian elites and also with the elites from today's Ukraine who were less willing to fight against Moscow. Because Russia, obviously, it emerges maybe in the 16th century. There's a debate where precisely Russia emerged, but I would date it more or less then. And this was our problem, and even when Zygmunt III he managed to capture Moscow, who didn't want to pay the taxes for the war? The Lithuanian elites. and this was our problem, and we paid for defending Ukraine for after the Union of Lublin, because this was basically the concern of the last Jagiellon on our throne, because he was quite certain that without the Polish help, Moscow will come after Kiev and Vilnius, and he was basically right. A bit fast forward 200 years, but he was right. So from this perspective, I think that what is important to highlight today, well, in Polish historiography, which never liked the Russian imperial narrative, is that we considered one of the biggest political mistakes of Polish elite the collapse of Union of Hadziacz, when we could transform the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth into the Commonwealth of Free Nations. And the problem is that we should have done it before the Cossack Wars. There is an agreement that this should be the proposal 10 years before Union of Hadziacz, which actually could succeed. But one of the reasons why it failed, and it was enacted by the Polish Sejm and was signed by the Polish king, was because part of the Ukrainian elite, the Cossack elite, was pro-Russian. And this was one of the reasons why it collapsed, because it basically could enter into life and transform the Commonwealth into a very successful political project. So this is our part of thinking. Obviously, it's much easier for us to discuss the history till the 18th century, because later it was a bit more complicated. But today, well, the Polish support towards Ukraine, we feel strongly that we need to embrace the common shared history, which we have. It wasn't perfect. There's no such thing as a paradise on earth, and communism proved it, especially. So in our thinking and our support towards Ukraine is very much our shared history together. And in the case of Lithuania, well, every Polish child learns, Litwa Ojczyzno moja from the very beginning. So Lithuania, our homeland. So it's we have a less troubled vision of the Union, even though we recognize the failures and hopefully, well, obviously the Commonwealth will not return, but our shared history, and this is also a part of the problem, because precisely the Russian immigration in the 20th century, when they started telling the imperial Russian narrative, they didn't really find space. And in terms even of pop culture, and I think this is important, especially for the younger generations, is that we don't have much stories shared. Orsha, the Battle of Orsha, which was very important. We don't have, the common heroes, even though they were there. But the problem with historians is that they very often focus on the political story, forgetting, like writers, that there were people around there, and you can tell a shared story and showing the positive and criticize the negative through some literary work which dates towards the glory days. Okay, thank you.
Very good question.
It's a good critical insight, and it's a valuable one, but no less valuable acknowledgement that the most prominent Polish dynasty comes from Lithuania, right? So therefore there is a common bond that we appreciate. We have a question over here, please.
My name is Bogdana Urbanovich. I'm the head of the Shevchenko Scientific Society branch here in Washington, D.C., Maryland, and Virginia. And I would like, it's not a question, I'd just like to add something, just very short. Number one, Soyuz. I was part of that. I lived in Ukraine. When Soyuz made these little badges with Ukrainian flag, they standed to us contraband away. And I remember wearing them. We were so happy. It was late 80s. We were wearing Ukrainian flags. That was Soyuz. And one more thing, I think we should add to our relationship. My mom's family from the Western Ukraine was deported to Siberia in 1946 with the little kids. When they arrived, they were like, it took a few months for them to finally arrive to the place they were deported to. And the only reason they survived, because they were Lithuanians there, forest brothers, which were sent before them, and they already created the environment. So my family, my mom's family, my family, survived because of that. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We have a question from Jill.
Hi, Jill Doherty, Georgetown University. It's a real pleasure to hear both of you this evening. Thank you very much. I have a more contemporary question, of course, which is the weaponization of history. Just today, I read that there is a new film or TV show, I'm not quite sure which, in Russia, which is called Nuremberg. And in that, strangely enough, the only people who are prosecuting the Nazis are Russians, and everybody else is left out. So then yesterday, of course, I read an article about new textbooks in Russia that have completely weaponized history. And so my question is, what is your concern? What do you think will be the ultimate effect of having now a new generation that's going to grow up with false history, that will be just, I looked at them and they look like little pioneers from 50 years ago. So just interested in what you think the implications of this are. Thank you.
Thank you. A wonderful book was published on the Soviets at Nuremberg 2 years ago by Francine Hirsch. So I really recommend it. Very good history. In terms of the weaponization of history, not just outside of Russia, but in Russia itself, that's the process that is underway already for some period of time. And there would be commissions, the truth commissions of the Second World War, what is right, what is not right. You have the head of the Foreign Intelligence Service to be the head also of the one of the historical organizations and associations there, and so on and so forth. And the president of Russia himself considers himself to be the biggest historian. So all of that is certainly the recipe for the really not just misleading, but poisoning the historical understanding and the understanding of the world for one more generation of Russians. And I see really no end to that, with the one exception, and that's defeat of Russia in Ukraine, which historically unsuccessful wars lead to the changes and transformations, from Afghan war and Gorbachev's reforms to Crimean War and reforms of Alexander II to Russo-Japanese War and the Revolution of 1905 and the World War I that was not going well for Russia because there was lack of ammunition, the so-called in Russian patronny golod. So that led, that is the biggest trigger of the revolution of 1917. So as long as that regime continues to be in power, things will be getting worse and worse. So that's where I'm pessimistic. Where I'm optimistic is in the ability of Ukraine to, with the help of Lithuania, with the help of Poland, with the help of the United States, to stop that aggression and in the process actually change Russia as well.
Thank you, Professor. We have two questions over here. If we could put them together, so if you could ask your question first and then pass over the mic to the gentleman behind you, and we can provide the time for Professor Plokhy to answer both of you. No, you please. So you first, and then you raise your hand. Yeah, please.
Mikhailo Vinitsky, Kyiv Mohila Academy. I have a question that actually has to do with historiography, because one of the things that we heard today was an interesting sort of joking reaction about Poles, Lithuanians, and Ukrainians. And it seems to be a reflection of sort of Mikhailo Hrushevsky's historiography, which was written at the beginning of the 20th century and obviously is emphasizing things about class differences, class where the Polish nobility, the Ukrainian peasantry, etc., etc. I'm wondering if there's an alternative historiography. I remember my days many years ago traveling to Lithuania, and I was in Trakai, and I was struck by the fact that there is this wonderful map on the wall which shows Vytautas Magnus and his lands going all the way to Odessa, which creates an interesting historiography because Odessa was, of course, created by Lithuanians, according to that story, not by the Russians at all. And the French had nothing to do with it. So I wonder, based on the fact that there's maps that show different stories, and when you look at this map, I actually just Googled Vytautas map. And the border runs approximately according to where we have today Russian occupation of Ukraine, and the unoccupied sections of Ukraine are part of what would then be considered Greater Lithuania. And my question becomes, are we perhaps not falling into the trap of class discourse and forgetting about geography? Because there is an alternative historiography that has to do with the fact that the steppe ends approximately at the Grand Lithuanian border, and there's something called Liso steppe, a forest that starts there. And that historiography basically makes Ukraine and Lithuania and sort of the end of Europe, but still Europe, facing a endless steppe of, well, let's just say a different culture. I don't want to come into clash of civilizations kind of historiography here, but I think that there is an alternative that we need to look at that is not just about Hrushevsky and class. I'd like to hear Professor Plokhy's comments on that.
And if I may, Professor, let's give a chance also to ask another question, and we'll try to keep them. Please.
I have just one question about the future. I read from time to time the idea of an intermarial kind of union in the future based on common cultural and economic past in the face of a common enemy. What do you think the prospects for those kinds of political ideas are for the future?
Thanks.
I will start with intermarium, and certainly it is rooted in history, very much history of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. But there is also more recent precedents, and that's related also to the Polish thinking after around 1920 or 1921 and so on and so forth. So and there is something happening in that regard, at least declarations between the foreign ministers of Poland, Lithuania, and Ukraine happening. The idea of intermarium in the 1920s was formed as the way to create basically an alliance there that would combine the forces of countries in Eastern Europe in opposition to the Bolshevik Russia at that time. Thinking about today and future of the project like that, I certainly welcome it as a political and cultural project, and with again something where the three countries can also address the issues of history of those countries and discuss them, because this is extremely important. But I don't see it in terms of the 1920s intermarium as some sort of a military alliance. The only game in town now is NATO. Within NATO there can be all sorts of configurations of cultural and political and historical nature, but that's where I would stop that thinking about intermarium. With regard to the class analysis, including of the Union of Lublin and the Polish nobility and the Union of Hadych is also again very often interpreted in class terms, because the nobility in Kingdom of Poland was very reluctant to think about the Cossack elite as being equal. The Cossack mass in the Hetmanate, in the Cossack state, was very critical of the idea that part of them can become nobles and the rest would stay. So it's not just the social factors are not just a way to interpret things, but also at least in my understanding, the legitimate factors that were driving many developments. But when the gates of Europe was mentioned in the history of Ukraine, when I was thinking about the factors that would actually last and would link the history of the region of 1,000 years together, those were the issues of environment, and those were certainly the issues of steppe. And when it comes to the steppe, especially in pre-modern times, don't trust any maps, whoever produced them. They put there the borders that didn't exist until the 20th century in terms of the clear line going this way or that way. The only way you could move into the steppe that was controlled by the nomadic cultures was basically under the protection of the rivers. And you don't see the maps where there would be the Grand Duchy of Lithuania here, and then there would be along the Dnieper or something, and you see modern borders from the 20th century. So we can't really impose those borders and our thinking about spatial things that come from 20th century, from 21st century, from the 16th to 17th century. But the steppe is a crucial factor in the history of Ukraine, which sets it apart from the history of Lithuania. Because what steppe produces, it produces, especially in the 17th and 18th century, the movement of the settled population into the steppe areas. That population is called the Cossacks. That's something that you don't have in Belarus, you don't have that in the marshes of Pripyat, you don't have that in the west of the Carpathians, you don't have in Poland. But not to say that the Polish or the Lithuanian or the Belarusian population participated in the formation of the Cossackdom. Yes, they all participated, but that's a phenomenon of Ukrainian history. It brings Ukrainian history close to the Russian history, because the Cossackdom is the phenomenon of all these Eurasian steppes from the Danube all the way to Amur. And it's all along major rivers. That's how the population moves into the steppes. But what is unique about Ukraine and Ukrainian Cossackdom is this links and connections to first the Grand Duchy of Lithuania and then to the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Because the Ukrainian Cossackdom emerged as an independent force in Ukrainian history to a degree that the Russian Cossackdom never was able to emerge in the history of Russia. And that was because of the particular political structure, the democratic traditions and so on and so forth associated with the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth.
One more question here from Mr. Wilson, please.
Thank you so much. This has just been fantastic. I really appreciate hearing your insights. I want to bring this back to a contemporary setting in which you've talked a little bit about how history has helped forge identity, nation. How is the history that's being written right now, the war, Ukraine's resistance, how is this history, how do you think it will shape both Ukrainian identity, the nation, as well as, from another perspective, Belarus, the identity in Belarus, the nation in Belarus, with a conflicted role in this moment? The second question is, some of us are working on, you mentioned NATO. A durable peace has to have a Ukraine in NATO. From my perspective as a policy person, what is the historian's case for a Ukraine in NATO? What's the historian's perspective on a Ukraine in NATO? As some of us are trying to figure out how to build that case, how can we draw on your perspective for this?
Sure. Well, thank you. First on history, we are in a historic moment. History is happening, or is being shaped by what is happening in Ukraine. History of Ukraine, history of the region, but also major impact on the global realignment. So it's local, but also global history is happening there. And the way how I look at that history, this is the history of the disintegration of one of the largest European empires, or Eurasian empires, land-based empires. So the story it doesn't even start with the fall of the Soviet Union. The story starts with the World War I and disintegration of the Russian Empire. That's where Putin's ideas are coming from, also in terms of what is the nation, what it is not. And what we see is happening is completely opposite to what Putin tried to achieve by claiming Russians and Ukrainians are one of the same people. Starting with 2014, there are just tremendous transformation in terms of identity happening in Ukraine. The nations are being imagined by people like Mickiewicz and Shevchenko and writers and poets and so on and so forth. They imagine in their heads modern nations. But it's a tragic events and it's wars that form and create nations. And there is a lot written about the nations, wars creating state. This is the case where the war is a major factor in the creation of a nation. So after the first 2 weeks of the war, it became clear once Ukraine didn't collapse on that 2-week schedule, it became clear that Ukraine would stay, even if it is occupied or something like that. That was a turning point, and again, that history keeps moving in that direction. Now, NATO. One thing that is already there is that Ukraine is on certain level is integrated into NATO more than any NATO member is.
Agreed.
Ukrainians can fight with the weapons coming from every NATO country. No NATO country can fight with the weapons coming from their most trusted neighbors. So it's not formalized. That marriage is not formalized yet. It's a partnership, but it's very clear where things are going and where things are moving. One thing that as a historian I can envision there, and just take with a grain of salt, because we historians have trouble predicting past. predicting future sounds like easier than predicting past, but there are some challenges as well. So one thing that I see already is happening is actually as the result of this war is disappearance of gray zones of Europe. And I don't see actually whatever the end and outcome of this war, I don't see that those gray areas re-emerging. Which means that Ukrainian state, again, the borders is a big question that we don't have answer yet, because the answer will be provided on the battlefield for the borders. But one thing that is clear that Ukraine ends up on the one side of that new divide and Belarus on the other. And I'm very, very worried about the Belarus, because what Putin declared with regard to Ukraine, one of the same people, that's something that can be, under certain conditions, give 10, 15, 20 years, can be very much implemented in Belarus. So I'm very worried today about Ukraine. Historically, I'm not worried about Ukraine at all. But I am historically very worried about Belarus.
Brief question right here from Mr. Arak, and before I see also one question in the back, so let's make those questions very brief because I think we're short on time.
Sorry, it's also a comment. It's about the intermarium. So there are more tangible effects currently in terms of politics and also economic cooperation between Central European countries, and this is the Three Seas Initiative, also covered by Atlantic Council papers, and this is more or less about building interconnectedness between North and South countries. And this does operate and has tangible effects as the Three Seas Fund, which is hopefully co-financed by the United States, who promised to give $300 million for it. And in my opinion, and this is my private opinion, I do believe that this could be also an element that could help in the process of reconstruction of Ukraine.
pass the mic over back of the room.
I'm Belarusian. I'm one of the 3 people who are part of the Belarusian community here in DC. And I thought about the question before you made the last comment, so it actually plays very well into it. As those of you who study the history of our region know that Belarus is basically on the fringes oftentimes in a lot of historical work. And as we also have heard from the comments today, there are a lot of parts of our shared history between Lithuania, Poland, Belarus, and Ukraine are still undecided. So looking into the bright future when the war is over, Russia is defeated, we're studying the reconstruction period, what are the chances, in your professional historical as a scientist opinion, that we will have some sort of a joint commission between the 4 nations, the historians, coming together and organizing proper textbooks, explaining the history of who did harm upon who at which period, and how it all played out, and how we have cooperated. Because when you look at the history, especially between 1919 from 1946 along the Curzon line, that is probably the darkest part of our modern history, and a lot of those questions are still coming up. Those events, many of us are children and grandchildren of people who have lived through all of that. So, what do you feel is there a chance in the 20, 30 years to resolve any of that?
Sure. Well, thank you for the comment on the intermarium, and thank you for this question. Well, that idea came first in the early 90s to Professor Kaminsky, who it seems to me was here at Georgetown. And he organized a project that brought together the Polish, Ukrainian, Belarusian, and it seems to me Lithuanian historians as well. Working together, it was an American-funded initiative, and coming from him, working together on the history, on the history books. People were writing their national histories, but as part of this collaboration. And for Ukraine, it was a very, very important project. Out of it came the best historical works of the 1990s by Natalia Yakovenko on the early modern history of Ukraine, and by Yaroslav Hrycak on modern. That came out of the project spearheaded by a Polish professor from Washington, D.C. Now, the bad thing about history and good thing about history for historians like me is that they're telling us stop rewriting history. Well, forget it. We'll keep rewriting it, and rewriting is absolutely necessary, because with every new generation, with every new geopolitical, cultural situation, we have different questions. We have a different set of questions that we have to go back and reevaluate things that we already started before, and look for the sources and look for interpretations that we need them. So there is no end to rewriting of history, and that means that there is certainly a future for the project, despite it doesn't mean that the work was done in the 1990s. We need to address new set of questions today, and we are looking for the intellectual leader who can do that and take it on herself or himself.
Professor Plokhy, I had my last question to ask you, but I realized that there are so many people in this room who want to get just a glimpse of your attention, to shake your hand or to say thank you for this delightful intellectual rigor that you shared with us today. So I better keep my question to myself, ask you privately about that. And before we proceed to some refreshments that are in the neighboring room, and I saw some Lithuanian and Ukrainian different sorts of beverages that do demand tasteful, and delicious kind of sort of encounter. That was the word we used today. I want to ask you for a round of applause for Professor Serhii Plokhy. Naturally, Ambassador Makarova, Ambassador Plepita, Ambassador Herbst, Ruslan, Ukrainian House, thank you very much for hosting us today. And Once again, Slava Ukraini!